Good afternoon, and thanks for joining the National Distracted Driving Coalition webinar, Evaluating the Effectiveness of Distracted Driving Laws. This webinar is hosted by the National Transportation Safety Board in collaboration with the National Distracted Driving Coalition and will last about an hour and a half. My name is Michael Graham, and I'm a board member with the NTSB, and I am pleased to open this webinar. Some of you may remember working with my colleague, former Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg. I am stepping into Bruce's shoes in this fight against distracted driving, and they are some pretty big shoes to fill. As you know, he was one of the National Distracted Driving Coalition's founders. For those of you who don't know the National Distracted Driving Coalition, it includes groups from academia, government, advocacy, and industry, each bringing their expertise and their passion for safety to the fight against distracted driving. In the advocacy community especially, many don't choose this fight. It chooses them when they lose a loved one to a distracted driver. Many have become experts on everything from the science of distraction to the art of advocacy to create change. For such advocates, the NDDC has been a huge shot in the arm, allowing each coalition member to contribute what they do best. Today, we are missing another founder of NDDC who wanted to be here but could not due to illness, Jennifer Smith. Jennifer is just this type of advocate. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration reports that more than 3,300 deaths from distracted driving in 2022, and more than 289,000 injuries. I believe those devastating numbers are actually much higher than reported, and each one is preventable. Let's think of it this way. At 65 miles per hour, for every 1 second a driver is distracted, the car travels about 100 feet. If a driver takes only 3 seconds to read and respond to a text, it's like driving nearly the entire length of a football field with your eyes closed. That's scary to think about, but many drivers take this risk every day. In fact, the National Occupant Protection Use Survey estimates that at any given moment, 6.3% of drivers are using their phone. I believe that no text and no call is worth your life or the life of someone else. In 2011, the NTSB recommended that all 50 states and District of Columbia ban the non-emergency use of electronic devices for all drivers. In the 12 plus years since then, no state has fully implemented this recommendation. However, since the recommendation was first issued, texting and driving is now illegal in 49 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Some states ban handheld phone calls. Others ban holding the phone at all while driving. The changes to state laws to limit distracted driving on our roadways would not have happened without some engaged state legislators and the safety advocacy community. And I want to sincerely thank you all for your efforts. That brings us to the primary question of today's webinar that we hope to answer. Do these laws work? As the recent National Distracted Driving Coalition publication establishes, evaluating the effectiveness of distracted driving laws is both an urgent task and an important one. This paper does not give us the complete answer, but it does point us toward the right questions and how to ask them. These questions include, what is the status of our distracted driving laws? For the states that have passed distracted driving laws, are they working? What effects have these laws had on driver behavior? Are high visibility enforcement campaigns effective? And have these laws prevented crashes and saved lives? As this movement against distracted driving makes progress in state houses nationwide, the conversation on measuring the effectiveness of the recently passed laws is both important and timely, and I am excited for today's conversation. Without further ado, I will turn it over now to our moderator, Nicholas Worrell, to start us off with panel introductions. Nicholas.
Thank you, Member Graham, for that kickoff to evaluating the effectiveness of distracted driving laws. As Member Graham said, very often, those who fight for road safety laws do not choose the fight chooses them, and they become involved in improvements to legislation, education, or enforcement. And we know that the laws have changed in large part because of their efforts, but evaluating the outcomes is only the only way to ensure that we are making progress. So it is fantastic that we see this effort to think about evaluating these laws in a systemic way. That is to take stock of what we have accomplished and how we can be more effective in the future. Today, we have three expert panelists to take us through present distracted driving laws and how to evaluate them. Audience, if you have questions, enter them in the chat box. We are tight on time, but we'll try to take as many questions as possible. Speaking of time, you can find our panelists' bios in the chat box as well, and the NDD and the National Distracted Driving paper on evaluating the effectiveness of distracted driving laws. But for now, it's name and affiliation only. First, we have David Zuby, Executive Vice President and Chief Research Officer at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, or IIHS. We will then hear from Robin Robertson, President and CEO of Traffic Injury Research Foundation. Our final presenter will be Greg Fitch, Head of Safety and UX Research, Android Auto at Google. Each will present, and then we'll turn it over to the next presenter. After our panelists have presented, we will try to take as many of your submitted questions as possible, so please add them to the chat box. So without further ado, let's turn it over to our first panelist, David Zuby. Thank you.
After California passed its texting ban in January of 2009, and you can see that while there was an immediate drop in the percentage of drivers observed texting, that after a year and a half, there were actually more drivers texting than before the ban went into effect. And we also talked about bans that prohibit drivers from using a handheld device to make a call. So here again is the results of IHS survey, looking at different behaviors, drivers who only talk hands-free, sometimes talk hands-free, only talk handheld, and never talk while driving. And you can see that there are some differences in what people from states with a ban admit compared to states without a ban. In particular, we see that in states prohibiting handheld phone conversations, more people admit to using a hands-free device. We also see that in states with a ban, more people say that they don't talk or drive at all. And among people who only talk handheld, there's a higher proportion in states without a ban. So those bans seem to be changing behavior, but not necessarily eliminating distraction if people are simply changing from hands-held phone conversations to hands-free conversations. Nevertheless, when AAA looked at what was going on in the wake of California's law banning cell phone conversations, they did see a persistent and long-lasting decrease in the observation of that behavior. Again, that may be because people are switching from handheld to talking by hands-free devices, but that ban seems to be holding up. We used data that was collected by DOT to examine laws in New York and also Washington, D.C. In New York, we compared what was going on after their law to what was going on in Connecticut that didn't have a law. And we can see, like we saw earlier, that in the immediate wake of the law, there is a drop in the number of people observed holding the phone to their ear. But eventually, the rate of people participating in that behavior increases, which is different from what we observed in Washington, D.C. Here we're comparing Washington, D.C. with Maryland and Virginia that didn't have laws at the time, and we can see that the results of the ban on handheld phone conversations in Washington, D.C. persisted for at least 2 years. One of the differences that the researchers noted between DC and New York at the time was that DC had more rigorous enforcement of the ban on phone conversation, whereas in New York there was less enforcement of the law. That changed, however, and so when we took a longer view of the laws in New York, the District of Columbia, and Connecticut, we do see that there is less talking on the phone than would have been expected without those laws. So banning talking by handheld phones changes behavior, but again, if people are switching from handheld phone conversations to hands-free conversations, it's not necessarily eliminating distraction. More recently, we've been able to look at data that is available from the phones themselves. One of the members of the National Distracted Driving Coalition is Cambridge Mobile Telematics, who have an app that is installed on many phones throughout the United States. And we've looked at that data, and it shows that, for instance, handheld bans on calls are more effective at eliminating those handheld calls than mere texting bans. This is as measured by the device. They also can measure whether or not the driver is manipulating his phone in some way that doesn't involve a phone conversation. And we can see, again, that prohibiting the handheld use of phones has a stronger effect on people's behavior than simply banning texting. And then, of course, laws are one thing, but it's also helpful to enforce the laws. People are generally, their behavior is influenced by whether or not they think they'll get caught. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has conducted high visibility enforcement campaigns in cities around the country to show that those campaigns could in fact be effective at further reducing the level of distracting behaviors involving mobile devices. These data show work that was done in Hartford, Connecticut, and we're using Bridgeport and Stamford as controls, but looking over time and comparing what's going on in Hartford versus Bridgeport and Stamford, we see a 50% reduction in people observed using the phone handheld to make a conversation, and a nearly 70% reduction in people observed texting. The results were not as strong in Syracuse, New York, but we did see a significant reduction in number of people texting. Of course, one of the things that could be used to enhance enforcement efforts would be safety cameras. They're being used in Australia, and there's at least one demonstration program in the state of North Carolina. To deploy more cameras to enforce bans on the use of mobile devices, the laws in some states may need to be changed to permit using cameras to enforce the laws. Now, while it's good that these laws are affecting driver behavior, what we ultimately want to do is see that once the laws have been passed, there are fewer crashes, and especially crashes that are caused by distracted driving. But this is a harder nut to crack. And if you look across the literature, we see studies that found decreases associated with laws, increases associated with laws, and no changes in laws associated with cell phone bans. The evaluations are challenging because not all crashes are caused by distraction. There are all sorts of other crashes, including impairment and just speeding and other things that lead to people crashing that wouldn't be affected by a ban. To the extent that we want to focus on distracted driving crashes, not all police reports do a good job of recording whether or not distraction was a contributing factor. And of course, most of the laws that we're talking about today only address distraction as related to mobile devices. So some distraction related crashes actually have other causes, whether or not that's talking to other people in the car, eating or grooming, or other activities that nevertheless distract the driver's attention from the road. So one of the earliest studies that we did, we tried to use our insurance data. Collision claims are those that pay to fix the car of an at-fault driver when he crashes it. And we used the frequency of claims, that is the number of claims divided by the number of cars, month by month, to compare California which enacted a law in against texting, and compared that to comparison states, that were nearby in geography and had other similarities. So what the analysis is looking for is the extent to which these two trend lines deviate from one another. And you can see that they track pretty closely with just a little bit of offset. And indeed, the analysis shows that in these 4 states, when texting bans were enacted, that was actually associated with an increase in the frequency of texting bans. For those of you not up on your statistics, those p-values in the last column, the ones that are 0.001 indicate that is a statistically significant result. And the last line there is a not statistically significant result. Nevertheless, for 4 states, we see an increase in collision claim frequencies associated with texting bans. Now, at the time, folks hypothesized that maybe crashes went up because, knowing that people weren't allowed to text, drivers are trying to hide the fact that they were texting, which would take their eyes further off the road, making them even more prone to crashing than if they were trying to watch the road while texting at the same time. That hypothesis has never been proved out. The other more likely explanation for this is something else created the increase in claim frequencies. Collision claims are notoriously associated with low severity events, some of them not even happening on roads. Like, for instance, if you back your car into another parked car in a parking lot, that will result in a collision claim for your car, but probably is unrelated to distraction and whether or not the state that you're in has a distracted driving ban. We also looked at handheld cell phone bans. These are bans that prohibited drivers from making calls by a handheld device. And here we found a little bit more mixed result, with collision claims going up in some states and down in other states. But 3 of these results really indicate no change in California, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C. But there was a slight increase in claims associated with the law in New York going on the books. So collision claims may not be the most focused tool for trying to understand what's going on with distracted driving laws. One of the things that we did more recently was try to understand whether or not we could use a surrogate for distracted driving crashes. Surrogates are common in safety research. A very common surrogate for drunk driving, for instance, is nighttime crashes on weekends. Why is that a surrogate for drunk driving? Because a lot of people drink more on weekends, and they drive after drinking more on weekends than they do during the week. So if you see an increase in crashes associated with that kind of behavior generally, you can maybe then use that to study impaired driving. In the context of distraction, this slide shows the result of a naturalistic driving study, which did find that if you look at drivers who are visually manually distracted by using their phone, there is an almost 2-fold increase in any type of crash. But rear-end crashes in particular are even more sensitive to the possibility, to the risk associated with visual manual phone use. And you see almost an 8-fold increase in the odds that somebody will have a rear-end crash if they're using their manual phone than if they're not. So we used that surrogate to study more recent laws in California, Oregon, and Washington. These laws, which were passed in 2017, replaced older laws that banned texting or banned handheld phone conversations. The new law in Oregon and Washington banned holding the phone completely. And in California, there was a slight variation in the law in that it banned drivers from holding and using the phone. So what did we find? In Washington, we found a reduction in rear crashes of any severity, and in California, we found no change in police reported rear end crashes at all. I can't show you results for Oregon because the period of this study involved a time when Oregon changed the reporting standards for property damage only claims. So that change in the property damage reporting requirements would have changed the result, would have affected the results in the post law period. I can show you, however, the results for rear end injury crashes that shows a reduction in Washington and Oregon, and again, no change in California. So it seems that the slight variation in the ways the laws are written may have an effect on whether or not people refrain from driving and consequently crashing. This slide notes some differences between Oregon and Washington in addition to the one that I mentioned earlier. We haven't proven that that's what's going on in California here, but this is a point that needs to be studied. Is that subtle difference in the wording of the law leading to these different outcomes? Finally, of course, we mentioned the number of people that were killed at the beginning of this webinar, and there have been a number of studies that have tried to look at the effects of laws on fatal crashes. And we categorize those results as promising but not definitive. If you compare states with some kind of a device use restrictions to states without any ban at all, this of course studies are from several years ago when no states had, when some states still didn't have bans. We see a modest reduction in fatal crash metrics. I use this generic term fatal crash metrics because in some cases they're counting fatalities, some cases they're counting fatal crash rates or other things related to fatal crashes. We see a little bit stronger effect in states that allow primary enforcement of bans on mobile device use. So again, the importance of enforcement is emphasized in the studies that are in the literature so far. But again, for the same reasons that I cited, that it's hard to study the effects of bans on crashes. These results, as I said, are promising, but they're not strong evidence of causal relationship. So now I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who is going to talk about the art of evaluation.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, David. I think you did a great job illustrating what we can learn from doing evaluations and why it's important to undertake those evaluations. So I'm going to talk about some of the key parameters around evaluations and some of the basics to hopefully set jurisdictions up to be ready to do an evaluation and to have thought through all the pieces of the puzzle. So some of the things that I want to talk about are what makes laws effective. And I think there's an important distinction to be made here. So having legislation that imposes a reasonable penalty for risky behavior is a way of communicating to society that that risk is unacceptable. So the purpose of the law is to discourage that risk taking at an individual level, but also to change social norms, the broader belief system about what behaviors are acceptable on the road. And one of the things that we've seen around legislation generally, not just distraction, but other road safety risks, is the mantra of increasing penalties. And increasing penalties is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece. It's really important once you have a law to also have consistent enforcement to increase awareness and create that strong general and specific deterrent effect, because that's what changes our behavior, at least influences our decision-making on the road. And the concept of deterrence and how we experience deterrence is really involving two different factors. One is drivers must believe that there's a real likelihood that they will be caught. That they will be detected engaging in risk-taking. So that's kind of half of the deterrence puzzle. The other half is their perception that there's a real likelihood of being caught. So the quality and quantity of enforcement that is part and parcel of the legislation plays an important factor in the outcomes that we see. I want to come back to the issue of penalties because there's really a perception that the higher the penalty, the more deterred we are. And as a criminologist, it's important to make a distinction between people who are self-select for safety, people who would not consider risk-taking or very minimal risk-taking versus people who engage in extensive risk-taking. Often when we think about laws and penalties, we believe that penalties deter us because we are law-abiding, and they would perhaps deter most of us, if not all of us, participating in the webinar. So for the average person, a significant penalty certainly deters behavior. But when it comes to offenders, that's not necessarily the case, because they have bigger concerns about other things, or they're simply not aware of the penalty. The penalty piece and the significance of the penalty doesn't factor into their decision making. So laws are an important first step, and the enforcement of laws is critical, but I think we need to be part and parcel of that education piece and not overlook that, as well as think about the role of technologies, which David touched on, and I think Greg's going to touch on a little bit, as well as helping create that deterrence. So the main reason that we'd want to evaluate a law is to know if what we're doing actually works. Is it changing our behavior? Is it reducing crashes? Is it reducing injuries? Because if it's not, then that needs to change. We no longer live in a universe of endless resources, and we really have to be cognizant of what interventions, what legislation we're putting in place, and what effect it's having, so we can really maximize the deterrence and the behavior change components. So when we're thinking about research projects as a whole, there are really two important objectives for evaluations. The first is to demonstrate that the law is indeed having a desired effect. And as David mentioned, he definitely showed you some evidence of effectiveness, and it's certainly promising, but we need more than one study, so to speak. We're looking for a convergence of the evidence across studies. So we need to do evaluations to know that what we're doing is working, and also to justify the continued investment in the resources needed to enact the law or enforce the law. And it also helps ensure that we're spending the most time and money on the things that are having the greatest effect. So that's one reason, or one important objective of an evaluation. The second one is really to understand how the law works, what parts of it have the greatest effect. And that's important for the idea of continual improvement. Interventions need to be constantly reassessed and improved, because society is dynamic, not static. So we need to not just rest on our laurels, so to speak. We need to continue to do better. So when it comes to evaluations, data is critical, and Greg is going to dive into that, but ensuring that the data are relevant and are well defined is essential to answer some of the key questions I'm going to talk about. And the other important comment I want to make with respect to data is simply having baseline data, knowing where behaviors, where crashes are at before the law goes into effect. Is really critical, because to do the best and most robust evaluation, having that pre-data, and David talked about that with respect to some of the studies, having that pre-data to compare is really essential. So there are really two important research questions, and a number of the studies that David touched on really addressed these questions. So one, did the driver behavior change after the law was put in place compared to before? So in order to answer that question, we need to make sure we have measures of driver behavior, which can be somewhat challenging. There are different types of driver behavior data and ways to collect it, but we need to have those measures before the law takes effect and those same measures after the law is implemented. Really, the two most common methods to measure driver behavior are either observational data or self-report data. And in thinking about an evaluation, making sure you have a reasonable sample size to measure what the expected difference is at a specific level of statistical significance is really important. So doing what we call a power analysis to figure out how big our sample size should be to actually be able to measure effectiveness is important. And then thinking about the issues of sample design and how we're going to do the research study also are really important when we're thinking about how generalizable are the results. How can we apply them to a broader population and know that we would see similar effectiveness? So that's one question. The other question is really, did the number of crashes change? And crashes can be measured differently, whether they're property damage or injury or fatal crashes. But to answer that question, collecting a solid crash data plan, having a strategy to collect solid crash data pre and post implementation must be developed. And that's something that will be more straightforward for states because there's a lot of collection already of fatal and to a lesser extent serious injury crash. So that's important. So having those categories and different breakdowns of types of crashes is important to measure change along separate dimensions. So you could look at all crashes irrespective of severity. You could look at fatal and serious injury crashes, or you could look at what David talked about, proxy measures. Certainly because changing a crash report and a police report is not an easy process, and jurisdictions are really at different stages of improvement in their distracted driving crash data collection. So if you can't get the specific variable, it's not actively measured, you may be able to use a proxy such as something like rear end crashes, which are characteristic of distraction. So those are really the key research questions that we want to address at a minimum within a research study. Some of the other key things to think about as the legislation is being developed, because you really need to think about an evaluation as the law is being put in place, because you are going to need to collect data prior to that law going into effect to be able to measure its effectiveness. So other key things include looking at potential data sources, what data are already collected. Many jurisdictions have crash and or some self-report data, but there are other types of data that Greg's going to talk about that are necessary to answer more specific research questions. Knowing how the data is going to be collected, and whether or not that data is representative of the population of interest that's going to be affected by the law, whether or the sample size that will determine what effect sizes are able to be detected. So those things are important when looking at data sources. And then, I mean, ultimately the quality and the usefulness of the valuation and its outcomes really depend on how robust data you can get. So working with database managers, working with analysts, thinking through those potential data sources for an evaluation is a great step. Other key considerations, you may need to develop data collection tools. So, you know, arrest and crash data very routinely collected. Observational surveys may or may not have been done in a jurisdiction, and then there may be other data collection tools. For example, if a survey collecting self-report data about behaviors or crash involvement is not available, then it may be necessary to develop that survey, for example. And NHTSA really created a great program evaluation guide, which gets into a lot of these key considerations in a lot more detail, and certainly the data elements of it. So I would encourage people thinking about an evaluation to also look at NHTSA's guide for highway safety program managers. Another key consideration is having an appropriate and a robust methodological design. So as David talked about, some studies are pre-post design, and that's an ideal way to measure what happened before versus what happened after the implementation of the law. But again, creating an evaluation plan in order to ensure that you're able to do that at the same time the law is being put forward is really important. And early planning for an evaluation can ensure when the time comes, for example, if the law has been in effect for a few years and now you're ready to do an evaluation, that early planning as legislation is being developed can ensure that you have the data that you're going to need to do a really strong evaluation, and you'll have some of those comparable measures that are necessary. Another example that David talked about with respect to methodological design is the use of comparison groups. And comparison groups are never perfect, but finding a comparison group that's very similar or as similar as is feasible is important, and having a comparison group is better than not. But looking at a neighboring jurisdiction where the law may be in effect, but it's not being actively enforced, or looking at a comparable study, comparable jurisdiction where there is no law, can help you can control for some of those other confounding factors that may explain the evaluation results. So that leads me right into controlling for confounding factors. So in epidemiological research, it's impossible to control for all the confounding factors. And that can make the interpretation of results a little more challenging, but it's important to, at a minimum, tackle some of the main confounding factors that could have potentially played a role. So, for example, one of the factors would be looking at your level of enforcement. If you're using a control jurisdiction, is the level of enforcement around an existing law the same in both jurisdictions or not? Because how the intensity of law enforcement, right, can skew some of those results. So trying to control for that by using comparable jurisdictions is really important. Another important confounding factor we often see in evaluations of legislation is it's not a single piece of legislation put in place. It's often multiple pieces. So if we think back, for example, to the history of impaired driving laws, there may have been blood alcohol concentration law put into effect. There may have been ignition interlock as part and parcel of that, and perhaps some education campaigns. All of those interventions at the same time makes it more difficult to discern whether or not it was the law that was responsible for the outcomes, or whether it was one of those other interventions that was put in place at the same time, for example, that was accounting for the outcomes. Okay, other key considerations, certainly working closely with the data collection team, making sure the data collection team has a good understanding of how data is being collected, and doing kind of that quality control and checking, certainly as data collection begins, is really important, because if there are problems or gaps, you can spot them and correct them in order to ensure that the evaluation and its results are still of good quality. So working with people who are observing in a observational study, making sure police officers are filling out all the boxes on the form, crash investigators are collecting all the data that's needed. So working with the team so everyone has a good understanding of not just what data is being collected, but how it's being collected and how that data is being handled is really important, because at the end of the day, if you have significant problems with data collection in any way, shape, or form, it really jeopardizes the usability of the results and whether or not researchers can draw any meaningful conclusions as a result of that study. Last key consideration to talk about is looking at what are the most appropriate types of analyses based on the kind of data that you're collecting and the robustness of the data you're collecting. So for a lot of studies, they're using simple univariate and bivariate techniques, and that's important. But certainly depending on the quality and the robustness of the data, it may be possible to use more sophisticated approaches like Bayesian analysis or time series analysis or logistic regression, which really gives you greater insight into some of the more mechanics of the law and understanding the relationship between different factors and different subsets. Is there a different in age? Is there a difference in, you know, location where people are being, you know, targeted by an intervention? You know, does the you know, the different periods of time, do we see, you know, temporal factors? Do we see differences between weekends and weekdays? So looking at some of those analyses and making sure you have a solid analysis plan is really important. It helps be more precise with the conclusions, and also for opportunities to either strengthen the law and or improve outcomes. So having a statistician involved in the development of the evaluation plan will really ensure that you're making the best use of the quality of data that you have and being able to answer the research questions that you're posing. So really key takeaways: it's not just set it and forget it with laws, which is the old adage. We really need to know if laws are having an impact. David provides some very promising research and some good studies, but we need more studies. We need more a more robust understanding of findings and what types of factors have the greatest impact with respect to a law to be able to optimize what we're doing. And then the key considerations that I talked about. So having a good set of data collectors, a good set of data, and a good analysis plan are really critical. So I'm going to stop there and I will turn it over to Greg to talk in more detail about some of the data.
Thanks, Robin. That's really great setup for me. Appreciate appreciate the teeing up of my talk. Can everyone see my slides all right? Yeah, I'm assuming so. All right, well, I can't hear anyone for confirmation. Yeah, okay, we're good. So yeah, one of the biggest data considerations that Robin pointed out is what data are you using for your analysis to evaluate or evaluation of a driver distraction law? And so I'm going to talk about all the types of data that are available for us to do rigorous research, robust research. So we put this study, we put this document together to kind of summarize what's available out there. And we identified nine sources for so far, and I'm sure there's others. So if and then we get to the Q&A section, if other people in the call are aware of any others, it'd be great to hear your input. There's the 9 main areas are public opinion data, police crash reports, fatality analysis and reporting system data, naturalistic driving studies, national occupant protection use survey, telematics data, overhead cameras, insurance claims, and fleet safety reports. I'm going to go through each of these with a little more explanation of what they are. So the first one, and a good one, is public opinion data. This is basically surveys. So you can go out and survey people in different states, or survey people before and after a law has been activated, has been implemented, and ask them things about their behavior, right? So like their self-reports of how often they do distraction-related tasks while driving. You can also ask them self-report how often they're involved in crashes or near crashes. And then you can get at other behaviors that are indicative of their proneness to risk, which is like how often did they get a ticket or not while using their phone while driving. So the strengths of this survey data is that it identifies whether the new law is changing self-reported behavior, particularly risky behavior, as well as the outcomes of risky behavior. The data is more easily and efficiently collected, and surveys relative to these other methods are definitely easier to perform. Not cheap, but definitely easier and less expensive than the other forms here. There are limitations though, and that is that there is a difference between what people report and what they actually do. And that is just the truth. Not everyone is forthcoming that they're doing distraction in the car, using their phone while driving, particularly since that behavior is now converted to being illegal. So we have to keep that in mind. This means that simply reporting a change in behavior does not mean that crashes have been prevented. And there can be other reasons why crashes are occurring too, so to keep that in mind. Also, people may be less inclined to report activities that are now illegal. Again, I just said that, so sorry, go to the next slide. The next form of data is police crash reports. So police crash reports are, a police crash report is put together at the scene of a crash. There's a survey, a form that is filled out, and these are then compiled at a local police office and jurisdiction, and then they can be accessed for research. So police accounting is done for fatal, severely injurious, and property damage crashes. And not all police departments do this, but most, several do. I think most do, and their reports are available to the public, specifically online or upon request. So, over time, these reports build up, and you start to get a sense of what's happening before a law is instituted and what happens after a law is implemented. And the accumulation of data from police crash reports allows for trend analysis. If a police reports do not systematically track distracted driving as a contributing factor, which can be the case, then rear end or runoff road crashes can be used as a reasonable surrogate, as David mentioned earlier in the talk today. There are limitations, though, for police crash reports, and that is not all crashes are reported to police. I think it's been estimated like 60% of crashes aren't reported to police, especially minor ones. Underreporting can lead to incomplete data and may not reflect the true extent of distracted driving crashes, particularly if they're the minor ones. Different police departments may have different reporting forms, making it challenging to compare data from different regions and draw comprehensive conclusions. People may not be able to report or may not be truthful in reporting what activities they performed prior to a crash at the scene to the police officer. So there's also that to consider as well. Let me go to the next slide. Another form, or the third form, is naturalistic driving studies. So for those that don't know what a naturalistic driving study is, it's a form of research where you place a camera and onboard sensors inside a participant's own vehicle, several hundred up to even thousands of drivers at a time, and you continuously record this video over the course of the study, which their participation can be several weeks to months to even years. And by continuously recording them, you capture their behavior, when they're not in a crash, as well as their behavior prior to or during a crash. And if you were able to perform such a study prior to a law being implemented and continuing to record that data after the law is implemented, you could actually see through the video analysis, did you change the driver behavior? And so what way? Were they truly holding the phone lower down, or were they engaging in other activities? Some of those questions that came up earlier could be answered with this form of research. So the strengths are: it captures real-world driver behavior and the seconds leading up to a crash or near crash, and it allows for estimation of crash risk, by comparing how often you see distraction, particularly the illegal behavior, prior to crashes, and comparing that to how often you see it prior to baseline driving. And you could do that before and after the law is implemented to look at crash risks, effective crash risk. There are limitations, though, in that the study, I should add it to this slide. It's expensive. The form of research can be expensive. At least has traditionally been expensive because of the cost of data and storing data, though that's come down a lot over the years. But also, fatal crashes are rare, and so there's this form of research does not have, to my knowledge, at least any fatal crashes captured for analysis. And so you have like a blind spot to some forms of crashes that have maybe coming or attributed to driver distraction. But the surrogates, the near crashes or the crashes that are injurious, they have the same precursors to fatal crashes. And so you can learn a lot about the impact of the law on driver behavior and outcomes by using that form of data. Okay, another form of research or data source is the National Occupant Protection Use Survey, or NOPUS for short. And this is simply a survey that is done by you have all your researchers go out to various intersections and they stand at the corner and they watch vehicles as they're slowing down or coming to a stop. And they're watching for, are these drivers using a phone? Are they engaged in a phone call? Are they visibly manipulating a phone? And this form of research has been ongoing for a while. I think it's been going on since like 2005, but potentially even earlier. But yeah, it's roadside observation of driver engagement in handheld phone use, and it's as a strength, it has the ability to show what's happening over years. So like it's been done annually for many, many years, and provides kind of an existing baseline. And then as you implement a law, you can see if there's been a change in this observed use of phones at an intersection. There are limitations, though, in that observations are performed at intersections when vehicles are nearly stopped or stopped. And we know from naturalistic driving research that this is where people engage more often in phone use as opposed to doing it while driving, because the vehicle is in an immobile state. This survey data suggests that drivers engage in secondary tasks more often in these scenarios, so that estimates may not reflect distraction prevalence in moving vehicles across different driving contexts. But another source I want to mention, which complements naturalistic driving data quite well, is telematics data. So this is a phone-based or car-based collection of kinematic or device data. Basically, we're capturing speed of the vehicle, how it's accelerating or decelerating, where its location is, like where it's driving, and whether the driver is using the phone or not. And this is all collected using data that exists on the phone or on the car. Smartphone data like this is currently used by the insurance industry and has been reviewed and accepted by regulators for basically use in billions of dollars of insurance pricing. And it has many strengths. So telematics data is driving telematics data from the phone has been shown to provide representative sample equal to and exceeding the analysis derived from the NOPUS survey data I just mentioned. There's a paper on this that IHS has done that's going to be published soon on this topic, if you're interested. Smartphone telematics data provides the ability to detect distraction behavior across all road segments and times when the technology is being used. And the smartphone-based telematics data is now being used for insurance pricing, claims notification, and crash reconstruction. I would say like another big strength here is that there's just way more people using smartphones, and the subscription of insurance, usage-based insurance or using telematics to impact your insurance has grown a lot over the years. And so there's just a huge sample size available for assessing, driver behavior from the phone. And by working, with this data before and after a law is implemented, you can see whether there's a shift in this behavior. There are limitations, though, in that telematics systems are not universally adopted. So not all vehicles may be equipped with such technology, leading to incomplete data representation. So you're not capturing the full swath of the population. And drivers may alter their behavior when they're aware that the telematics is monitoring them in a program with, it may affect the accuracy of the data related to driver distraction laws, since drivers may be changing their behavior after not necessarily because of the law, but because of the telematics program, is what I'm trying to say. Telematics data relies on sensors and technology, and occasional glitches or inaccuracies may occur. It's also important to note that telematics data doesn't know what the driver is actually doing, because there's no video or inside view of what the driver's doing. It's all based on indications of what they're doing on the phone and in the car. David talked about overhead cameras, so that this is definitely another data source that's the viability of this is being piloted in North Carolina and has been done well in Australia and is showing promise. But roadside observation cameras kind of work like NOPIS, but they can be done where the vehicle is moving, not necessarily at a stop. And so that's a huge advantage for overhead cameras. But they can also capture other behaviors like seatbelt usage and the speed of the vehicle. But yeah, you basically have a camera on the side of the road, and the camera captures real-time images and data that would be unsafe or convenient for human observers to capture. And the devices have potential to measure prevalence and can be used, how often a phone is used or how often we're seeing phone use while driving, and can be used for enforcement purposes such as research to increase knowledge. It is a new technology and can be fixed or mounted, but devices are being piloted in some jurisdictions like in North Carolina. And so with the feedback and with the testing of the technology, it'll hopefully get to a point where it's worth wider deployment. So David's data is also based on a lot of insurance claims. It was based off insurance claims, and that can be really insightful. So this is a huge source of data to take advantage of. But we can look at whether types of claims, specific types of claims like rear-end crashes, have increased before or after a new law is implemented, as well as just severity has changed after new laws have been implemented. But yeah, David talked a lot about insurance claim data and what we've seen, across different states. Finally, and this kind of complements naturalistic driving studies, but fleet safety, so truck fleets, cab fleets, they have onboard recorders that capture video of the forward roadway as well as video often of the driver, or they just capture acceleration like the telematics data I talked about just a minute ago. But the fleet safety reports typically are more detailed, and the fleet safety program looks at the risk of the fleet and looks at how to manage the risk of that fleet, and is quite aware of the behaviors that increase the risk to the fleet. And so if they're seeing a drop in those behaviors after a law is implemented, that could be a pretty compelling sign that the law is effective. It enables employers to assess, so the strengths are, it enables employers to assess their safety, the fleet safety's risk, and looked at also the impact of training and whether more training is needed in certain areas. But there are limitations in that fleet safety reports only capture data from commercial trucks and taxis, not the whole driving population. And so there's you're only getting a picture of professional drivers, not the average driver. Fleet drivers are financially motivated to follow these policies, so it may not reflect, necessarily the effect of the law, but more like their desire to keep a job. And not all fleet incidents may be reported consistently, leading to potential gaps in the data. Data from fleet safety reports may be influenced by factors specific to the company. So some companies may have more of a penalty for breaking the law than others. And so they could see changes there based on company policy. And consolidating and standardizing data from various fleets can be challenging for this reason, since it's not all done the same way. So a takeaway, and it's just kind of to build off what Robin said, is that in order to know whether it's worth continuing the investment, we need to have good insights into the effectiveness of a law. And just doing one study with one source of data is not going to give you the full picture. You're not going to have a complete idea, a complete source of truth with one study. So you need to do robust research. And what we mean by that is you have to triangulate across studies. You have to do multiple studies with various types of data sources and see if they're telling you the same story. And so that's the whole takeaway here, is to be aware that you're not going to get an answer with one study, and you need to be mindful that there's lots of data sources out there to take advantage of. And that's my talk.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all the panelists. Member Graham and everyone, we appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. And This is where we dive into a couple questions. We had quite a few submitted by the audience. So let's go ahead and get started with these. Any correlation data on distracted driving and impaired driving? And I'll ask all the panelists to bring their cameras up, please. Would anyone like to take that question? Any correlation data on distracted driving and impaired driving?
Okay, so I'll jump in. I can tell you that's a good question, and insurance companies, insurance regulators have been very interested in it. So in Canada, we've spent quite some time improving data collection and getting a better understanding of the role of distraction in fatal crashes. And we actually did a comparison of the prevalence we see of impaired driving to distracted driving. And there's certainly a degree of similarity in terms of the size of the problem. We know in Canada, 1 in 4 fatal crashes, a little bit more than 1 in 4, involves distraction as a contributing factor, and that's about where we sit with impaired driving as well. In terms of offenders engaging in both behaviors, there's certainly a proportion of traffic offenders who are what we call persistent. We used to refer to them as the 10%ers. So it's not uncommon, for example, to see an impaired driver with other criminal violations, but also other traffic violations. So the general rule is when you see drivers that are engaging in multiple kinds of risk taking, obviously the more they warrant our attention and the more of a risk that they pose on the road. So I don't know, David or Greg, if you wanted to chime in on that.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies looking at that correlation for many of the reasons that we talked about, the difficulty of tracking distracted driving related crashes. There is a difficulty in understanding, whether or not these two behaviors coexist and to what extent. Impaired driving is typically measured either through arrest rates, drivers who have been arrested for drunk driving, or in some kind of roadside surveys where people are pulled over to test the level of alcohol on their breath. But of course, once they've been pulled over, they're not driving anymore. So the relationship between what they were doing before they were pulled over and when they're pulled over is now gone. So I think that is an interesting question, and I would finish by adding that hardly any crash has a single contributing factor. So there's almost certainly some degree of overlap between crashes caused by distraction and crashes caused by impairment. But as far as I'm aware, it's not been measured precisely.
Thank you. Greg, did you want to weigh in or?
I don't have any more to add to what Robin and David said. So yeah, it's just, that it's an outlier group, like Robin called it the 10%ers, whether they're the same that are impaired that are also distracted. I'm not sure. I'm not clear on the research on there.
Okay. Next question is, what is the status of distracted driving laws in the US and how do we compare them to other countries?
Well, I think there are a couple of sources to know what the status of laws in the United States are. You can go to iihs.org and you can see our categorization of the laws that are in effect in 50 states and Washington, D.C. I think somebody put in the chat a link to a Google file that has information about distracted driving laws. One of the challenges you or researchers may run into in looking at the categorizations of laws is different organizations categorize the different laws differently. Or you can just get a list of all of the legal text and do your own categorization if you want to go to that trouble.
I can jump in and say internationally, a lot of countries have put in place some degree of distracted driving law. I can tell you, certainly in Canada, the severity of the sanction is much more significant. In some jurisdictions, you could be paying $1,000 and looking at, 2 to 4 demerit points for violations, depending on the nature of the violation. But we do participate in an electronic survey of road user attitudes, which is called the Ezra project, and there are actually 43 countries involved. And one of the issues that Ezra looks at is distracted driving. So it looks at handheld as well as hands-free phones. And if I can find the link for the Ezra project, I'll put it in the chat, but that's a great place for comparison purposes.
Thank you. Next question is, should law enforcement investigate to see if the person who caused the collision or wrongful death were using their phone? And shouldn't this person also be fined, ticketed, license suspended? Anyone?
So I believe that most states, maybe not all states, do have a place in their police reports where the officer is asked to make a determination about whether or not distraction was a contributing factor to that crash. Most of the time, that determination is made by talking to involved drivers who, as Greg mentioned earlier, may not be forthcoming about their pre-crash behavior, or in cases where somebody has died, you may not be able to interrogate that person about their behavior. I think it's only in rare cases that police go beyond simple interview techniques to investigate the role that distraction may have played.
Thank you. I'll jump to the next question unless any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that. Do you have any further information about psychological factors that contribute to repeat offenders? Repeat the question. Do you have any further information about psychological factors that contribute to repeat offenders? Anyone?
I guess their worldview is different. They spend less time thinking about other people on the road. They spend less time, many of them are impulsive. They spend less time thinking about the consequences or anticipating the consequences of their action. And as I said earlier, their behavior may be more impacted by other things, not a law, but perhaps the social dynamic of their group. If they hang out with a group of people who think that, driving using their phone is fine, they're more likely to have those behaviors reinforced. And certainly if they've used their phone repeatedly and never been crash involved, and my colleague Karen always likes to say the word yet, because it's an important caveat, but if they've never been crash involved, then they may assume they're an above average driver and therefore, that law doesn't apply to them. And a lot of people just underestimate how long they're taking. And I think, Greg, some of the naturalistic driving study work that you did really showed that people underestimate and don't understand how long they're actually distracted.
Greg or Dave want to weigh in on that question? Do you have any further information about psychological factors that contribute to repeat offenders?
I mean, there's a lot going on for why someone would be distracted. Like there's various forms of distraction. From just like having a conversation with someone next to you, to eating, to listening to music, to communicating either by voice or by texting. And so why does someone do all those things? It's the need to, in general, actually stepping back, it's also based on where are they driving, how long are they driving, like there's different types of driving context as well. And so why someone is distracted, just this all over the place. Do they need to learn how to get somewhere? Are they on a road trip and they're starting to fall asleep and they need to stimulate their brain? There's a whole distribution of driving scenarios and a whole distribution of driver states that have to be thought about here as to why but when we're talking about repeat offenders, it could be someone that's constantly in one of those particular driving contexts. It could be someone that's constantly getting a reward, like the dopamine release for communicating, right? Like that's been researched and discussed, not in this presentation, but in other forums, like why someone would be on social media, why someone would be communicating, but the repeat offender part is like in any risk behavior in the human population, you're going to have a distribution of people, right, that don't do it at all, do it sometimes, and do it all the time. You look at seatbelt usage, 94% of the country is wearing a seatbelt, 6% are not. And, it's what is it about this group of people, and is it the same across impairment and distraction? Like, you got to ask yourself, actually, it'd be great if someone hasn't studied it to go research what is common about it. But there's something more than just a law or something more than just a behavior. It's a way of living for repeat offenders. So it's something I don't know enough about to really speak more to.
Right. Well, if Greg had nothing, I'm going to move on to the next question because we got quite a few here and I want to get to as many of them as we can. Has there been any studies on the difference between deterrent versus incentives for following behaviors? Has there been studies on the difference between deterrence versus incentives for following behaviors?
I don't know if there's been any specific studies done, but we know that deterrence is part of it, right? But the sanction has to be reasonable. Once the sanction's no longer perceived to be reasonable, then people tend to not pay attention to the law and not have faith in the administration of justice. From an incentive point of view, we know that that incentivizing behavior can be positive, whether it's speaking up to shape behavior of those around you. When we talk about why we don't drive distracted, it influences people in our social group to do the same. They feel pressured to do the same. And then, I mean, there's often talk about insurance reductions, which is kind of a different, it's a whole different element to it. So I think that there are things that we can do to incentivize behavior change and not just, sanction people, because what's most important to change behavior is for people to be able to see themselves in the situation and realize, one, the risk that they're taking, and two, self-efficacy is important. People have to believe that they can accomplish the change. So I don't know, David, if you wanted to jump in on that, or Greg.
Well, I'll just say real quickly that there probably is research on the effectiveness of incentives versus penalties in general. I'm not aware of any such research in the context of distracted driving, although we do know that incentivizing people to not drive distracted can change their behavior. Our colleagues at Cambridge Mobile Telematics have done some experiments where they essentially set up contests among willing participants where they were rewarded if they refrained from using their devices while driving. And, they could see, a significant change in the degree to which participants did decrease their distracting behavior in response to the incentive. But I don't think that's been directly compared to, penalty type system.
Yeah, I'll add, like I was going to mention CNT's data. Like, I don't have the study, and maybe there is one, but I've heard them present, and I've seen them talk about like the benefit of financial motivation, being financially motivated to change how you drive. Like, when you can get a lower insurance rate, that changes behavior. Whether it changes the behavior of the persistent, the repeat offenders, the 10%ers, is unclear, but it definitely shifts the behavior of those that do it sometime or think about it, or are willing to think about what behaviors they engage in. And so, at a high level, reward, this is a great question, by the way, and it just goes to show, like, the laws are all deterrents, right? But like there's also, you can play both sides of you can play both sides by also encouraging good behavior with rewards, and that's something to consider here.
Right. Great. Yeah, some really good questions. I think this one might be for you, Greg. More and more cars have built-in graphics display, in particular Android Auto CarPlay, that mirror the phone display on the car. And the use of these considered distracted. Is the use of these considered distracted, both in terms of any laws and in terms of any data that you have presented? You want me to read it again, or you good to go?
No, I can answer it. I mean,
Right.
it's a little outside of the scope of the talk, but I will say, because maybe you haven't heard me talk about this, there's been other NDDC forums where I've gotten to share how Android Auto is designed and how we think about it. But a very high level, there's 4 safety principles that we follow that Android Auto subscribes to. And one is that the tasks that are done in Android Auto are kept short and simple. The second thing is that drivers can use their voice to perform these tasks, which allows them to keep their eyes on the road, hands on the wheel. Third is that with Google, we are able to anticipate what drivers are going to be doing, because drivers in particular are creatures of habit. For the most part, they do something one day, they're probably going to do it the next day. And so by anticipating what they're likely to do and making it easier to do by surfacing it for them, they don't have to dig around the interface to do their tasks, where they otherwise would be doing that on their phone. And then fourthly, if a driver is browsing, we have techniques in the product that get them to look back at the road for long periods of time and rebuild their understanding of what's around them. So we have a set of safety principles that we build to, and then we test. We test in driving simulators, we test on test tracks, we test on the road with National Institute of Driving Research. We work with Virginia Tech and MIT and other universities to do independent research, and we learn about drivers and how they use our product, and then we make changes based on what we see. So that's my answer to the first part of that question. What was the second part of the question?
Second part of the question is the use of these considered distracted, both in terms of any laws and in terms of any data that you have presented? Yeah,
the laws are focused on handheld, manipulating a handheld phone. And there's the risk while driving is connected to taking your eyes off the road for long periods of time. And so when you reach for your phone in particular, it's been shown visibly manipulating a phone. It's been shown to that Justin Owen study that David cited. It was the visible manipulation of the phone that was leading to that risk that we were seeing reported, the 2 times, the 8 times increased risk of a rear-end crash. And so what you have to realize and appreciate is the reduction in the need to look away from the road when the tasks are simple and made short for drivers.
Greg, I'm going to stay with you. There's another question here. Is there a reason that the availability of vehicle infotainment systems, including Google, Android Auto, and distraction, their cause is not a data source? Is there a reason that the availability of vehicle infotainment systems, including Google, Android Auto, and distracted driving, their cause is not a data source?
I think it's not a data source in this report because it would be there before laws implemented and there after laws implemented. So we wouldn't be using that as a data source to evaluate a driver distraction law unless I'm missing something. What we're looking at is data sources that would capture changes in driver behavior, whether it be things they do in the car or the outcome of that behavior, which is a near crash, lane departure, near crash, or a crash itself. So that's why.
Okay. Next question is, how do we make use of cell phones and speeding socially unacceptable, like wearing seatbelts and drinking and driving? How do we make use of cell phones and speeding socially unacceptable, like wearing seatbelts and drinking and driving? Anyone?
I can take that and build off what we answered earlier, which is let's look at the power of rewards. Let's look at the power of rewards to motivate drivers to do the right thing, and that is becoming more and more possible today with the technology that we have in the cars, the technology that we have on the phones. So I'm like, that's what I'm taking away from this call today, is just like we need to double down on rewards.
Yeah. And there's actually criminological research which shows 4 incentives for every sanction is kind of the optimal balance you want to hit. And I mean, the other strategy that we do not make enough use of is making sure people have some simple facts so they can speak up when they see it. The most critical time to change behavior is when the person's engaging or about to engage in it. So as a passenger in a vehicle, for example, speaking up in social groups with your friends as you're going somewhere, you know, planning your trip or going home, being able to speak up about why you would never use your phone while driving. I mean, I've been asked multiple times about using a phone while driving, and I drove for, you know, I drove for a long time without a cell phone because we didn't have cell phones. So for me, when I'm driving, I don't care. I do not care who's calling. I am not willing to die to get to my destination. And that's probably what I talk about most often. I think it's important to change behavior for people to speak up about those choices whenever they have the opportunity to do so, and having just those few facts to back it up.
I also think it's important to keep in mind that saying that impaired driving and not wearing your seatbelt are socially unacceptable is a bit of a mischaracterization. Nearly half of the people, more than half of the people killed in the United States are not wearing their belts. And it has been a persistent factor of about 30% of fatalities are associated with an impaired driver. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people get in their car every day after having had consumed alcoholic beverages, and no one's raising further concern about that. So, you know, we made progress at cutting the percent of alcohol involvement in crashes from 50 to 30, but it's been stuck at 30 for more than a decade now.
Thank you. Another question here is on telematics. Telematics can have issues on phones because they assume a phone is in a car and the car belongs to the driver every time when often there are passengers. I wonder if there's a fix for this.
So our colleagues at Cambridge Mobile Telematics would claim that they have ways of discerning drivers from passengers. I don't know how robust their methodology is. The other thing that I would point out is that to the extent people connect their phone via Bluetooth to speakers and microphones in the car, that's probably a pretty strong indication that that's a driver's cell phone, not a passenger cell phone. But the person who raised this question is correct. There is some ambiguity in the measurement of distraction by devices through the devices themselves. But, you know, people who are using it think that they've reduced the ambiguity to an acceptable amount.
Right. I'm going to dive into the final question for the day. What are your thoughts on developing harm reduction technologies, example, hands-free versus enforcing a zero-use policy law? What are your thoughts on developing harm reduction technologies, example, hand-free versus enforcing a zero-use policy law? Anyone?
I can take it. So I have a pretty developed opinion about this that we've talked about publicly in other forums, but unlike impairment, unlike in drowsiness, you know, where you're in an impaired state for the whole trip, driver distraction is very context dependent. You're distracted, you're attentive. You're distracted, you're attentive, and it is very much dependent on what's around you, the type of driving, how difficult it is for an outcome. Like David said, crashes are really a result of one factor. This is really true in a distraction-related crash. So where we are is where we've been is setting policies, creating technology, designing technology based on the assumption that you don't know who's driving, you don't know where they're driving, you don't know how they're driving. But where we are today and where we're going in the future is data giving you that understanding, right? And so if we have the ability to understand the context and understand the situation, we're better positioned to adjust to technology, adjust the interface, adjust the safety systems, safety systems that are in place and how sensitive they are, how they work, calibrate everything so that in the end, the driver is not involved in a crash.
Anyone else wanted to weigh in on that, or?
I would just chime in and say that things like zero use policies in principle make a lot of sense, but the practicality of enforcing that, it's not realistic, it's not sustainable, and we simply don't have the resources. And that's why some of the technologies are really so important to nudge drivers in the right direction, is because enforcing laws and doing nothing else is very costly. And if you can't enforce a law, there's really not a lot of purpose in having one. So I think we need to find the balance to deter people, but also to incentivize people and push them in the right direction to make better choices.
Thank you.
I will just add that
Go ahead.
another product of the National Distracted Driving Coalition was a report about technology that could be applied to help mitigate the risk and consequences of distracted driving. And some of what Greg mentioned is explained more thoroughly in that report, as well as other ideas that members of the coalition had about ways technology could be brought to bear against this problem.
There's something more here, which is when you're talking about zero use, you're basically advocating for a sterile cockpit. And there's a couple of problems with that, with driving. One is that people typically, or if they're not doing one thing, they're going to do something else. So if you outlaw one behavior, that could be easily substituted with another behavior that could end up being worse off. But also the type of driving that people do, there's some driving that is in congested traffic. There's other types of driving which is on long roadways, straight roads, where it's easy to fall asleep, and people do fall asleep, and drive off the road. So there's, anecdotal evidence and now also evidence that people are using phone calls. When I say people, professional drivers are using phone calls and CB radios to offset the drowsiness that they're experiencing when they're driving 11 hours a day. And that was something that was, we studied for over 10, 15 years now. But what we're seeing now is as you're supervising a system that's doing half the driving for you, if you're just supervising it and not doing anything else, you are more prone to fall asleep or get drowsy sooner than if you're involved in the full driving task. And so drivers have this state where they can be overloaded, or they can be this state where they're underloaded. And where you want drivers to be is in this middle place where they're optimally, attentive. And technology can be used to help them when they're overloaded and saying, hey, watch out for that car, or hey, you're about to go over this lane. But it can also be helpful when they're underloaded and stimulating their brain to be like, hey, get back into the driving, get back into building your awareness of what's around you and not falling asleep. So that's the reason for how we think about attention in the car.
Well, thank you all. And before we close out, I don't know if Member Graham is still on. Before we close out, we have a little time left. Let's do a quick lightning round of key takeaways. If there's one standout thing from your presentation that you would want the audience to run with today and do something about distracted driving, what would that be? Let's start with you, Robin.
Thanks, Nick. I think as states are turning their attention to distracted driving, and we're seeing a lot of legislative activity. I think it's so important to meet with people in your highway safety offices, meet with people in your enforcement communities, meet with your advocates, and meet with your data managers, data analysts, to think about how you would evaluate your law. We really need more studies to get a much better understanding of what works, what key elements are most effective, and how can we better use resources to make a real change in behavior, but also a real change in crash outcomes.
Thank you, Robin. Dave?
So the first thing I would say is that there is a lot of research on the effectiveness of laws and other interventions to try to prevent crashes. We think we've done a reasonable job of summarizing that in our report. But if you're the kind of person who likes to delve into the details, we've also provided bibliographical references. Please avail yourself of that if it's of interest. The other thing I would say is that it's not just laws against distracted driving behavior that need evaluation, but any intervention that is attempting to make roads safer needs to be evaluated in proper ways. And that could include things like, enforcement campaigns or changes in enforcement tactics, and so on and so forth. So it's vitally important to discover what works, and in the cases where things aren't working as well as we hoped, to try to conduct those kinds of studies that allow you to come up with new ideas that could improve upon what's already in place.
Thank you, Dave. Greg?
Yeah, I mean, we wrote this report to look at how to evaluate laws, right? Deterrence for behavior. And the takeaway from this side of the, the study, this side of the perspective is that, there's lots of reasons why behavior might change. There's lots of reasons why an outcome might change. And so you need to capture that. You need to study that from multiple perspectives to have a full picture of what the implication or the impact of your law is. And as Robin said, you can't just study it after the law's implemented. You have to have a good understanding of what's happening before the law is implemented, and compare that to what's happening after the law is implemented to have an idea of whether there's a change. But also know that as you drive throughout the year, seasonality has an impact on risk and your involvement in your likelihood to be involved in a crash. And so you need to have a control group to compare across time as well. So it's complicated. The how to do an evaluation is complicated. But my other takeaway that I'm glad we had this talk is that it's not just looking at the deterrence, but let's look at the effectiveness of the rewards, the same data sources, right? And let's see if we can learn which one's better or how do they work together in concert.
So thank you thank you all. Really appreciate you all taking the time, and on behalf of myself and the NTSB and all the member organizations of the National Distracted Driving Coalition, thanks to all the panelists and to all of you who joined the webinar today. If you want to learn more about the Distracted Driving Coalition, you can reach out to any one of us. Our information is available. We dropped the bios in the chat earlier. Feel free to reach out. Of course, we have more work to do. Ultimately, every life lost to distracted driving is one too many. And you all know that our goal is zero. 3,300 lives a year is simply far too many. We need to firmly establish our progress against outcomes like this to know how we are doing, and this webinar marks a step in the right direction. And I appreciate everyone, the panelists, and every one of you joining the webinar today, taking time to hear this discussion.